The sharp tang of cigarette smoke pierced the air as Emily ducked through the crowd, outside Northview High. She pulled her sweater tighter, avoiding eye contact as classmates sauntered by in tight-knit packs, already immersed in gossip and inside jokes from summer adventures. Not for Emily. Her only adventure had been conquering another bout of paralyzing anxiety just to make it through the front doors. Senior year was supposed to mark her escape from the shadows. Yet she still blended into the walls like a ghost, unseen and unnoticed. She fished a crumpled piece of notebook paper from her bag, smoothing the creases to double-check her schedule. First period English in room 212. As she scanned the hallway numbers, her heart jumped at a sudden touch on her shoulder. Need some help finding your class? Emily spun to face a smiling stranger, his mossy blue eyes crinkling at the edges in a way that made her stomach flip. He was handsome in a roguish way, with tousled brown hair and stubble lining a strong jaw. Yeah, English 212, she stammered, cursing her inability to act cool. He chuckled. Right this way. I'm Dan, by the way. Just transferred here from out of state. Emily. She fell into step beside him, clutching her bag straps until her knuckles ached. Emily, Dan repeated, rolling it around as if tasting each syllable. Pretty name for a pretty girl. So what's your story? Emily froze. No one had ever called her pretty before, at least not so straightforwardly. She stared at her scuffed Converse, unsure how to respond to such forwardness from a stranger. Hey, it's okay, Dan soothed, placing a gentle hand on her arm. You don't have to say anything. I get that I'm new, and probably come on strong. It's just, there's something about you, Emily. I felt drawn to you the second I saw you alone in the crowd. His earnest tone caught her off guard, though part of her warned not to trust so easily. Before she could muster a reply, they arrived at her classroom. Well, here we are. I'll see you after, Dan asked as the warning bell rang. Emily nodded dumbly, and he flashed her another heart, stopping smile before sauntering down the hall. She watched him go in the hall. She watched him go with equal parts fascination and apprehension coiling in her gut. This wasn't like her at all. To so quickly warm up to a stranger, let alone a gorgeous guy paying her positive attention. Yet something in Dan's piercing gaze saw straight to her core, easing her constant fretting, if only for a moment. English passed in a blur of syllabi and seating charts. Emily sat alone near the back, invisible once more as cliques reformed around her like impenetrable walls. She pulled out her notebooks, tracing the scribbled spirals etched across every page with lines from thoughts she didn't dare voice aloud. Before long, the final bell rang. As she packed up, a folded piece of notebook paper drifted onto her desk from somewhere above. Her heart leapt at the untidy scrawl on the front. Emily, meet me outside. Let's walk to lunch together. Dan. She pressed the note to her chest, trying to decipher the strange flutter it sparked. Why did this boy, a perfect stranger, make her feel seen? Dare she let down her guard even an inch when he could just as easily hurt her? Then again, sinking back into the shadows alone seemed an even bleaker fate. Gathering the tattered shreds of courage within, Emily exited into the crowded hallway. Sure enough, Dan spotted her at once from against a row of lockers, throwing her a crooked grin that sent a shiver down her spine. Hey, stranger. I was hoping you'd come, he greeted as she joined him. His cologne wafted pleasantly, woodsy with underlying hints of citrus. Thanks for the note, and for showing me to class earlier, Emily said shyly, walking beside him through the press of students. Dan slung an arm casually around her shoulders, though the gesture instantly set her nerves ablaze. His touch alone seemed to command her full attention, whether she willed it or not. Don't mention it. I was happy to help. So tell me more about yourself, Emily. What are you into besides being super cute? She blushed furiously, but couldn't help smiling a little too. Oh, not much. Reading, writing, stuff like that. I'm boring. Dan scoffed. No way. You've got depth, I can tell. I bet you've got great stories in that beautiful head of yours. His compliments seemed so genuine, amplifying Emily's natural curiosity about him as lunch grew nearer. They chatted easily about favorite books, sharing a love of gothic horror, music tastes, and places they wished to travel. For once, Emily didn't feel judged or pressured to reinvent herself for popularity's sake. Instead, she found comfort, opening up layer by layer to Dan's rapt attention. By some twist of fate, they lined up side by side for the cafeteria. Her new friend continued telling amusing tales of his eccentric family back east, never failing to make her laugh, even through her lingering shyness. Perhaps senior year wouldn't be so bad after all if she had Dan by her side. She caught herself hoping. As they chose seats at an empty table in the corner, his eyes locked with hers, suddenly serious. I'm really glad we met, Emily. You seem so special, like someone I can truly be myself with. I know it's fast, but you maybe want to go out sometime, just us? Emily blinked in disbelief. No one had ever asked her on a date before either. Her heart soared at the prospect, yet logic screamed it was too good to be true. She picked at her food tray, unwilling to shatter the magic but anxiety pulsing in warning. Before she could reply, Dan leaned in, breath warm against her ear. You don't have to answer now. Take your time and really think about it, okay? No pressure at all, but I'll be here whenever you're ready. If you're ready. He pulled back with an understanding smile that weakened her defenses further. Emily nodded mutely, her mind swirling as the lunch period passed in a sea of first impressions, reunited friends, and above all, Dan's palm squeezing hers under the table in gentle reassurance against her worries. For the first moment since summer, she almost felt normal. But somewhere deep down, dread unfurled its roots that this strange yet exhilarating connection with her mysterious classmate would bring anything but. The days grew shorter as autumn descended on Northview, yet Emily felt the darkness within receding each time her phone buzzed with a message from Dan. What started as casual study sessions together evolved into long talks, late into the night, sharing their hopes, fears, and burgeoning dreams for the future in ways she'd never dared with anyone else. With Dan, she discovered a part of herself she never knew existed. Effervescent, lively, and unafraid to embrace life's wonders rather than shrink from them. In turn, he listened intently to her quieter musings, never judging the morbid curiosities that fueled her writing, but meeting each new idea with intrigue instead. For the first time, Emily felt truly seen. Nights curled up on her bedspread, notebook propped on bent knees, replaying their messages endlessly. With Dan, her haunted thoughts seemed lighter, her innate magic welcomed rather than scorned. His unwavering faith in her abilities cultivated a fragile yet blossoming confidence, blooms unfurling from the darkness within. Whatever strands of magic bound them together, Emily never wished to let go. The days passed in a whirlwind of new discoveries, from debating philosophy over coffee to exploring the eerie backroads stretching into the forest behind Emily's house at dusk, talking for hours as shadows stretched taller. At the weekend fair, Dan surprised her with tickets to the midnight scene slated in the community center, laughing off her nerves with sly jokes until she giggled too. His touch lingered as they walked, sending shivers down her spine. Some nights found them no's, buried in texts on medieval torture devices, or obscure murder ballads. Yet other evenings dissolved under the blue glow of her bedroom TV as Emily drifted asleep, curled in Dan's lap, safe in the circle of his arms. She slept easier than she could remember, dreaming of nothing but their future adventures together. Yet, as the weeks passed, Emily began noticing subtle shifts in Dan's demeanor whenever she took too long to text back or canceled plans last minute due to anxiety. At first, only playful pouts or teasing remarks, which she brushed off with an apologetic caress that always soothed his mood again. His jealousy emerged in possessive remarks about other boys from her classes, eyeing her in the halls. Still, Emily reassured herself these were just signs of his care and passion, not cause for concern yet. After all, Dan apologized profusely whenever he snapped, insisting his temper came from wanting to monopolize her limitless light and goodness in a world too cruel. And how could she resist when he turned those magnetic blue eyes on her, pleading for forgiveness with a kiss that scattered all doubts? The winter formal loomed ahead, school routines becoming a welcome distraction from growing tensions at home. Emily hoped the dance might bring them closer somehow, giving Dan a chance to show his sweet side without constraints. For days, she agonized over the perfect dress while he dropped cryptic hints about their big surprise. Finally, the night arrived in a whirl of sparkles and twinkling lights. Dan picked her up in a sleek black suit, speechless as he twirled her on the front porch under puffs of frozen breath. A corsage of delicate plum blossoms encircled her wrist, their petals soft against her racing pulse. "You look otherworldly," he finally whispered, pulling her closer to brush her cheek with his lips. Emily shivered pleasantly despite her fur wrap. All worries and darkness seemed banished under Dan's magical presence alone. The dance passed in euphoria. Dan swept her across the floor in intricate dances, eyes never leaving hers as if no one else existed inside the glittering hall. During a slow number, he tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, expression soft yet intense all at once. "I know it's fast, Emily, but being with you feels like fate. I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." He lowered his voice, nuzzling her neck until she melted against him. "Say you'll be mine, officially." Emily's heart stuttered at the implicit question laced in his whispers, mind reeling with a joy so complete it almost hurt. All she wanted was to drown in Dan's aura, forever, letting his light guide hers aflame. "Yes," she whispered back without hesitation, sealing it with a kiss that broke open a dam of passion within her chest. Dan swung her around the room, broadcasting his triumph to jealous onlookers she didn't notice. In that perfect moment, Emily let herself believe a happy ending could truly be hers at last. But as the song faded, Dan's hold tightened almost painfully. His smile twisted into something uglier, eyes flashing a molten rage that chilled Emily to her core. She followed his icy gaze to a smiling classmate across the room, another loner named Asher, who sometimes chatted with her in the library. Panic swelled seeing Dan striding over, fist clenching as Asher's smile turned puzzled. Then, terrified. "Dan, stop!" Emily cried helplessly, clutching his arm to no avail. He towered over the slighter boy, anguish etched in every line. "Stay away from what's mine, you pathetic worm," Dan hissed loud enough for those closest to hear, shoving Asher backward into a group of shocked onlookers. The chaperones dove in at once, dragging Dan away as Emily sobbed apologies, heart splintering into pieces. Her perfect night lay shattered at her feet, revealing fissures in Dan she prayed weren't real. In the weeks that followed, Dan showered Emily with gifts and promises this was a one-time slip, begging on hands and knees for another chance. A part of her believed if she just clung tighter to his light, his darkness could never touch her. Still, she maintained a cautious distance, rattled by Dan's ugly possessiveness exposed at the most public moment. His jealousy only intensified thereafter. Calls and texts came in a never-ending barrage if she took too long to answer, always demanding to know her every thought and movement. Going to class alone became a struggle under his constant suspicion of unseen suitors lurking around every corner. Guilt weighed her down for tempting fate and feeding his chaotic moods with tiny perceived betrayals. One blustery Saturday found them curled on Emily's sofa, watching haunted houses specials and munching popcorn through the dreary afternoon. Subtly, though, Dan's arm tightened around her waist until she squirmed, discomfort rising amid his shifting disposition. He drained 2 glasses of spiced rum, far quicker than she expected. "Dan, you're holding me too tight," Emily murmured nervously as his free hand inched up her thigh. She attempted to shift away, but his grip turned steely, fingers digging harshly into her flesh. Panic surged through her veins like electricity. "Don't play coy with me, darling. I see how you look at those other boys, no matter how innocent. You think I don't notice?" Dan spat, eyes glinting darker than she'd ever seen. His alcohol-laced breath assaulted her senses, lips peeling back in a snarl. Emily squirmed helplessly, terror rooting her to the spot. "Please, you're hurting me. And I never looked at anyone, I swear." "Liar," Dan roared, shaking her violently. Emily dared not cry out, afraid to further stoke his rage. Instead, she went limp, praying he'd come to his senses and release her crumpled form. After an agonizing moment, Dan flung her aside with a snarl, storming from the house as she lay weeping on the floor. That night, Emily cried herself to sleep, haunted by Dan's terrifying shift behind closed doors. Trapped in her own home, his shadows bled into every corner regardless. Soon, walking the halls alone filled her with dread of Dan awaiting around the next bend to drag her back under his shadow's thrall forever. She knew then no amount of apologies or reassurances could undo the night's glimpse into Dan's true nature unleashed. His mask had fully slipped, leaving a monster in his place. And Emily suddenly felt more alone than ever before. The weather grew colder, yet Emily felt only ice in her veins each day at school. Dan haunted her everywhere like a vengeful spirit, eyes tracking her every move from across rooms and between classes with a newfound cruelty that sliced straight to her bones. She began arriving early to slip into homeroom unnoticed, leaving each day in the rushed exodus of bodies pouring from exits to lose him in the masses. It was the only time she felt she could breathe again. Most nights, she skipped going home altogether, preferring the library's stale confinement over facing Dan's volatile moods alone within her walls. There, she lingered after closing, hidden among aisles creaking in the dark until exhaustion claimed her, curled against the frosted glass paneling. Anything was better than the memories infiltrating her dreams. Each time slumber pulled her under, of his sneer, claws digging mercilessly into her flesh like a rabid animal. Emily took to sleeping with the lights on, yet found no escape from her tormentor, even in waking. Paranoia plagued her steps that Dan lurked behind every corner, ready to drag her back under his suffocating hold. No reprieve came, not from friends who drifted apart long ago or neglectful parents blind to her silent suffering within their own home. She was utterly trapped under Dan's sinister control, an insect pinned helpless beneath the roaring flames of his insatiable obsession. His methods of torture evolved into more psychological machinations instead of physical. Demanding calls and messages hounded her relentlessly if she dared leave him on read for too long, questioning her every move with sneering accusations of imagined betrayals. He knew exactly which threads to pluck to unravel her already frayed nerves into absolute panic and submission, once more under his masterful manipulations. In person, Dan alternated between cloyingly sweet apologies, swearing to devote himself solely to her happiness, and volatile outbursts, tearing her down piece by piece until she caved under the emotional torrent. Any show of resistance was met with threats so subtle yet bone-chilling in implication, leaving Emily no choice but to pacify his rages with demure obedience, lest she invoke his wrath once more. She stopped going to the library, to classes, pulling further into herself like a wounded animal slinking from the world. Her spirit felt shattered beyond repair under Dan's daily torture, leaving only a hollow shell going through robotic motions, while her psyche unraveled thread by thread. Even writing brought no solace anymore, her special place tainted by Dan's malevolent presence, looming over every private moment and thought like a vengeful shadow. One chilly night found Emily huddled under quilts, desperately trying to smother the sobs racking her battered body as rain lashed the glass and sheets. A crack of thunder ripped the sky, matching the fissures splitting open her heart. Just then, a crash downstairs jolted her upright, every muscle locking in abject horror. Darkness pressed closer than ever before, the creaks and howls of the storm, joining a sinister congregation permeating her very soul. She nearly leapt out of her skin at an insistent tapping on the bedroom window. Emily's breath stalled in terror at the figure silhouetted against the pitch outside, one hand poised to rap again while the other rose in a sardonic wave. Her blood turned to ice in her veins at the phantom invading even this final sanctuary. She scrambled backward until her spine collided with the wall, scrambling for anything to defend herself as the tapping grew louder, more frantic, more demanding. "It's me, baby. Let me in out of the rain, will you?" Came Dan's muffled plea from beyond the glass, tone smooth as poisoned honey. A vise closed around Emily's throat at the realization he must have broken in downstairs, come to claim his prize at long last. She was well and truly his prey now, with none to witness her last struggles. "Emily, please. I just want to talk. I swear." Dan continued cajoling, fist pounding the glass hard enough to splinter thin cracks across its surface. She recoiled with a whimper, limbs seizing up in terror while her mind raced frantically for escape. There was no fighting him, not physically at least, but through the haze of panic, a flicker of an idea sparked. One last desperate bid for salvation before she drowned forever in Dan's darkness. Collecting the tattered shreds of her shattered nerves, Emily inched toward the window on unsteady legs, keeping well out of his reach. "Okay, we can talk, but you have to promise not to hurt me," she called faintly over the raging storm, praying her voice didn't betray the terror strangling her windpipe. Dan's expression morphed from intimidating to ecstatic in an instant at her slightest compliance. "Of course, darling. I would never, ever hurt you. You know that. Now please let me in before I catch my death," he pleaded once more, so sincere in his affection. One might almost believe the act. Almost. Emily steeled her fraying resolve. "I'm sorry. I can't do that. But if you really care about me, you'll prove it by leaving, for good, and never contacting me again." She forced out far more firmly than expected past chattering teeth. Inside, she crumbled under the weight of her own brazen defiance before his unpredictable wrath. For a long, tense moment, the only sounds were crashing waves, punctuated by distant sirens, closing in fast on the surrounding neighborhood. Emily locked eyes with the mad prophet below, awaiting her inevitable damnation at his hands for daring to defy his control. Instead, his features melted into such a cavern of hatred and peril that she recoiled further into the corner on instinct alone. "You think you've won, you worthless slag. Mark my words, no one else will ever want a broken toy like you. You'll come crawling back before long, begging for my affection once more. And I'll be waiting, love. Always waiting," he vowed in a voice like venom before tearing from the yard into the raging downpour. Emily collapsed in a weeping heap, his ominous prophecy echoing through the hollow chambers of her mind even long after his departure. Yet buried amid the wreckage, a dying ember of her humanity refused to be extinguished so easily, though his talons still sunk deeply beneath her skin. Tonight she made the first strike to reclaim her spirit from his sinister grasp once and for all. And whatever it took, she vowed with newfound fire in her veins, she would break free or perish in the attempt. The days crept by in a haze as Emily drifted through routines on autopilot, Dan's words echoing through the barren hallway of her mind. His shadow still loomed around every corner, malevolent eyes peering from the depths to rip her spirit back under at his whim. She took to avoiding even the library now, aimlessly circling blocks under sullen skies as neighbors hurried past with downcast eyes, blind to her invisible anguish. Yet somewhere within, a spark refused to extinguish, one final hope for salvation glowing faint yet fierce. If Dan was right, and no one else could ever want her, then she had nothing left to lose by taking the ultimate leap toward freedom. Scribbled notes filled battered pages with escape plans, hatched in lonely dawn hours. Snippets of a future beyond his control piecing together through her fraying determination. One where Dan was but a scar on her soul, rather than the shackles dragging it down to drown forever in his depths. The following Saturday dawned overcast yet sharp with promise of change on the horizon. Emily rose before dawn to pen her goodbye, carefully taping the pages inside worn notebooks to keep her resolve safe should he ever pry them open, hunting for weaknesses. With a steadying breath, she exited into the pearly light of a new future, striding toward the salvation she prayed awaited if her desperation reached out far enough. At the station, shadows played across its antiquated facade like grasping fingers in the misty half-light. Emily shook off the thoughts and pushed through the creaky doors, immediately met by the din of weekend calls, blaring across dispatch radios, and harried voices, bouncing off faded tiles. An officer sat doing paperwork behind the high counter, glancing up with a tired smile and beckoning her over. "What can I do for you, miss?" he asked kindly, though Emily gulped back surging panic as the finality of her actions truly struck home past the point of no return. Even so, escape was within reach if only she found the courage to seize it. Taking a shaky breath, she explained her horrible situation in quivering tones, fishing out notes as damning evidence amid fresh tears dampening her collar. The officer's face grew solemn yet intent, immediately calling in detectives while soothing reassurances that Dan would never harm her again. In that moment, a weight miraculously lifted from her chest to be finally free from carrying her agony alone any longer. Just then, movement in her peripheral caught Emily's eye. A lone figure emerging from the parking lot mist, features sharpening into ones she knew all too well. Her blood froze over in mute horror while Dan grinned, slow and evil, from across the lot. He knew. Somehow, despite all precautions, he had known exactly where to find her weakness laid bare. "Do not panic," the officer said low and calm beside her, though his own grip tightened over the radio. "I will handle this safely. You have my word. Now go wait inside and let the detectives know what's happened. We will apprehend him and make sure he never threatens you again." Emily nodded woodenly and slipped back behind the counter's scant cover, peering through the frosted panels as Dan swaggered nearer with Predator's intent gleaming in his irises. She knew then this confrontation had been fated, the final reckoning where one of them would cease to haunt the other for good. Only her will against his madness now, with no one to intervene, just as he surely intended all along. Outside, Dan halted before the officer blocking his entry. All traces of humanity vacated his pallid features contorted in fury's ugly mask. "Where is she?" he snarled like a rabid dog straining against its leash. The officer stood firm. "Sir, you need to leave the premises immediately or you will be detained. This young woman has filed a report against you and your behavior is extremely threatening." Dan threw back his head and cackled, the sound rasping against Emily's eardrums from her quivering perch. "Of course she has, the worthless tease. But you don't understand. She's mine, and I intend to make that perfectly clear before I'm through." He lurched forward with a guttural yell, fishing inside his coat only to produce a glinting object flashing. Emily's scream joined the crack of gunfire, splitting the air, pain lancing her side, yet fading under shock's numb embrace. Through watery vision, she witnessed Dan crumple to the wet asphalt, still clawing at nothing, crimson bloom staining his shirt as life fled in rasping gasps. Over, just like that in a single violent act, cut wretchedly short. Paramedics swarmed the scene in a blur while Emily drifted, untethered from her leaden flesh at long last. In those fleeting moments between worlds, a lightness filled her like helium, spirit soaring aloft on the breeze, far beyond anyone's reach to trap and claim ever again. For the first time since that fated chance encounter, she felt utterly free. Sunlight bathed her features as consciousness slowly returned, lulling Emily from the ether like a siren song beckoning her weary soul home at last. Harsh fluorescence and sterile walls greeted waking senses, yet brought calm rather than panic's vice grip. A kind nurse assured her all was well now, flashing a comforting smile before exiting softly. She drifted in and out of troubled dreams, fragments threading together the disparate parts of herself, steadily healing in body and mind's quiet places in the aftershocks of violence's ugly passing. Days melded as recovery stretched on, familiar faces drifting through her hazy awareness, sharing empathy, caring where cruelty reigned for so long. Emily let their bombs soothe wounds that would surely scar her memory, yet no longer define her essence or snuff her rekindled fight. As strength returned, so did clarity and purpose in gentle waves. Emily rose on unsteady yet grounded legs to face the future, forged from ash and sorrow's lessons. Her spirit shone brighter for weathering darkness depths. Inner light guiding footsteps toward adventures unknown yet endlessly expansive, beyond these walls at long last. And though trauma's shadows lingered in quiet corners, Dan's malignant grasp was lost memory's fog, leaving only her renewed will and determination burning fierce as a wildfire within. Years later, Emily looks back on that turbulent period as a rebirth into who she was truly meant to be. Undaunted yet empathetic, brave yet soft, alive in each fleeting moment instead of drowning in what haunts the fringes of perception. She publishes works touching countless others, healing from private torments, hoping to foster compassion where there was none before. While memory still stings, it no longer immobilizes her spirit's growth into its infinite potential. Dan's poisonous hold lost its power to define her long ago. Now, only her light remains, eternal as the stars. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, willing the creak of footsteps down the hall outside her apartment door to fade away. She'd been on edge all evening, possessed by an inexplicable sense of impending danger. Just as the phantom noises ceased, a sharp rap at the door made her jump. Steeling herself, she peered through the peephole and stifled a gasp. Jared stood there, fist still raised to knock again. His eyes flickered back and forth, burning with an unsettling intensity, even through the warped lens. Sarah held her breath, hoping he would assume she wasn't home and leave. But he knocked once more, louder this time, the vibration carrying through the solid wood. "Sarah, I know you're in there," Jared called out, his voice barely containing a snarl of frustration. "Open up. We need to talk." Her mind raced through potential escape routes as she pressed herself against the door, as if she could melt through it and disappear. The balcony was too high to jump from without serious risk of injury. Her phone was in the other room. If she ran to grab it, he might break the door down before she could call 911. She was trapped with no choice but to face him, hoping her words alone could end this nightmare. Twisting the deadbolt open with a shaky hand, Sarah pulled the door open a crack and peered out with wide eyes. "There's nothing left to say, Jared. Please leave." Her tone was steely with attempted confidence, but Jared wasn't fooled. His nostrils flared at the suggestion of being dismissed. "Don't give me that," he spat, shoving against the door with his shoulder until Sarah had no choice but to let him barge inside or be crushed. She backed away slowly as he prowled further into the living room, hands clenched into trembling fists at his sides. Every fiber of her screamed to run, but escaping wouldn't solve the root issue. She needed to make Jared understand once and for all that his obsession ended here. "We had one date, Jared," Sarah stated, proud of how calm her voice sounded despite churning panic. "I'm not interested in pursuing anything further. You need to accept that and move on with your life." His eyes flashed dangerously at her words, lip curling in a sneer. "Is that what you think this is about? One stupid date? I thought we had a connection, Sarah. But then you had to go and throw it all away over one little argument." Jared stepped closer, and Sarah retreated 2 paces back until she collided with the wall. Her mind flashed to their confrontation in the alley outside the gym last week, his fingers bruising her arms as he screamed in her face, spittle flying for rejecting his slobbery kiss. She'd managed to knee him between the legs and flee, but the memory of his wrath still sent chills down her spine. This was a man capable of real violence. "I said no means no," Sarah replied, hating the tremor in her voice, but keeping eye contact steady. "My answer isn't going to change, no matter how many times you show up here uninvited. Now leave before I call the police." For a beat, the threat seemed to work. Jared blinked and took a step back, raising his hands in a mocking placation. But then his face twisted in on itself, mouth stretching impossibly wide in a wordless howl of rage that curdled Sarah's blood. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between them, fist striking out with bone, cracking force. Sarah twisted at the last moment, the blow glancing off her cheek instead of shattering her nose. Pain exploded across her face, but she ignored it, dropping into a low crouch and launching herself at Jared with every ounce of her strength. They crashed to the floor in a whirlwind of flailing limbs. Sarah clawed and scratched like a wildcat, going for the eyes as she'd been trained in her self-defense class. Through the haziness of adrenaline, a single realization cut through. She was fighting for her life. Chapter 2. Red Flags Appear. Sarah winced as the antiseptic stung her numerous cuts and scrapes. She'd cleaned and dressed her wounds as best she could after escaping from Jared the night before. But the event still replayed on an endless loop in her mind. No matter how hard she scrubbed, she couldn't wash away the memory of his hands closing around her throat or the mad light in his eyes as he squeezed. She'd fought him off through sheer primal instinct, gouging his face hard enough to make him howl and roll away, clutching at bleeding eye sockets. In those precious seconds, Sarah scrabbled to her feet and bolted for the door, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock it behind her. By some miracle, she made it to her car unscathed and sped off into the night, Jared's enraged screams still echoing down the empty street. Now, dawn light streamed through the blinds as Sarah finished patching herself up. Deep purple bruises looped her neck like a gruesome necklace, a permanent reminder of what could have been her fate had she not escaped with her life. She was supposed to meet her friend Amanda for coffee this morning to distract from her trauma, but how could she possibly explain these injuries without reliving the assault all over again? A knock at the door jolted Sarah from her grim thoughts. Amanda must have shown up early. "Steel yourself," she told her reflection before going to answer, remembering what the self-defense instructor always said about owning one's story. Survivors don't have to hide or feel ashamed. But it wasn't Amanda waiting in the hallway. Jared stood there, face a nightmare canvas of scratches, still weeping trails of blood down his cheeks. His expression warped from false concern to a feral snarl at the sight of Sarah's battered neck. "Please, we need to talk," he said, attempting a placating tone at odds with his murderous eyes. "What happened last night? I didn't mean to hurt you like that. You know how I get when you push me too far." Sarah slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, hyperventilating. She knew this wasn't over. Jared had made it clear he wouldn't stop until he'd broken her completely. Grabbing her phone with slippery hands, she dialed Amanda in tears. "Hey, sir, what's up? I'm almost there for coffee. Amanda said cheerfully before registering Sarah's panicked gasps. "What happened? Are you okay?" Between shaking breaths, Sarah managed to choke out the truth of Jared's assault and his return just now. Amanda assured her the police were on the way right away before comfortingly instructing Sarah to breathe slowly and arm herself with whatever was handy, just in case. The next few hours passed in a blur as officers took Sarah's statements and examined her injuries. An emergency protective order was issued against Jared with his photograph distributed to all local patrols. But Sarah knew it may not be enough. Jared seemed beyond reasoning and had proven he wouldn't hesitate to escalate his attacks. Over the next few weeks, strange things began occurring that drove Sarah's anxiety to a fever pitch. One morning, her tires were all slashed outside her building. Another night, creepy, stalkerish phone calls piped through with heavy breathing, but no words spoken. She started jumping at every shadow and noise, wondering if Jared was hiding just out of sight, waiting to strike again. Then one evening, Amanda spotted an all-too-familiar figure loitering outside the gym where Sarah used to train. She snapped a covert photo of Jared glaring up at Sarah's apartment windows before speeding off into traffic. It was the final confirmation Sarah needed. He was monitoring her every move, perhaps even breaking in when she wasn't home. The locks and cameras her landlord installed offered little comfort against such a cunning stalker. In a desperate move, Sarah changed her number, moved to a new apartment across town, and scrubbed all identifying details from social media. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly looking over her shoulder as she walked alone at night. But no matter how well she hid, Jared's obsession refused to dissipate. One afternoon after work, Sarah emerged from the subway station to find all 4 tires on her car slashed beyond repair. Scrawled across the driver's side door in dripping red paint were the words, "You're mine." Sarah dissolved into hysterical sobs, realizing too late that no place would ever feel truly safe again as long as Jared was still out there in the shadows, hungering to possess her completely. Chapter 3. Fighting Back. Sarah winced as footsteps echoed down the alley behind her, quickening into a jog. She cursed herself for not calling an Uber, instead foolishly believing she could handle the late-night walk home after a stressful day at the office. Now, alone in the dark urban maze, any shadow could hide a threat. Gripping her keys between clenched fingers like claws, Sarah picked up her pace without outright running. The last thing she wanted was to appear prey fleeing a predator. A sick feeling told her who pursued without looking. She'd been right to fear Jared had somehow tracked her down once more. Sure enough, his grating laugh carried down the alley as he closed the distance between them. "Come on, Sarah. Don't be like that. I just want to talk. Can't we put the past behind us? I miss you, baby." She shuddered at the slimy affection dripping from his voice, gathering her resolve. No amount of pleading or terrorizing would make her his victim again. Rounding the next corner, Sarah spotted the glowing exit sign of a 24/7 dealie up ahead, and sprinted as if her life depended on it. Bursting through the door, she spotted the bored-looking teen cashier and gasped, "He's after me. Please call 911. Just then, Jared crashed through as well, skidding to a halt at the sight of potential witnesses. His normally composed mask slipped, revealing a feral monster hiding just below the surface. The clerk alerted the owner, who emerged with a baseball bat while dialing emergency services. Jared glowered but made no move to flee, as if daring them to lay a hand on him. His rage felt radioactive, poisoning the very air. Sarah collapsed against the counter, sobbing with relief, but knowing this was far from over. Jared's eyes bored into her, promising future retribution. After that close call, Sarah lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. She carried pepper spray at all times, changed routines, and drove anxiety, inducing escape routes to work that added an hour to her commute. Still, the stalking continued. Endless nuisance calls on her office line, locks glued shut so she couldn't leave at night, Sarah felt like a mouse, toying with a demented cat who relished her terror. Her boss, noticing her obvious distress, agreed to flexible hours so she rarely walked alone. Several more unnerving encounters followed, each ratcheting up Jared's unhinged behavior. He left ominous notes under her windshield wiper, sneaked into her building while maintenance worked on the system, jumped out at her from alleyways, hoping to catch her off guard for just a moment. Her friends began staying overnight to keep vigil, taking shifts so Sarah was never alone. But Jared found ways to penetrate even these defenses, threatening messages appearing like clockwork, claiming he knew their every move. Sarah struggled to maintain routine as her fear consumed more of each day. She lost weight from stress and jumped at small sounds, constantly peering over her shoulder, no matter where she went. Her friends urged going farther into hiding, but Sarah refused to let Jared chase her from yet another life she'd worked to build. She needed to take a stand, once and for all, before his stalking madness destroyed her completely. A plan began formulating in Sarah's overwrought mind. If she lured Jared somewhere isolated under false pretenses of reconciling, she could get a clear recording stating his intent and threats, the evidence she'd been denied for so long due to lack of physical harm. Finally, the police would be forced to see him as the dangerous predator he was, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. It was a bold, risky move. But living under Jared's shadow had become worse than any death she could imagine. It was time to take back control. Consequences be damned. All she needed was the perfect opportunity. One frigid night, waiting alone for a train, that chance arose. Loud footsteps crunched on newly fallen snow behind her isolated platform. Sarah spun calmly to face Jared, who emerged with a twisted grin as if he'd been summoned. "Fancy meeting you here, baby. What do you say we get out of the cold and talk?" His toxic pleas blended with the howling wind as Sarah steeled her nerves. The endgame was set. Now she just had to survive long enough to see it through. Chapter 4. Confronting her stalker. Sarah shivered uncontrollably as she waited in the shadows of the condemned office building. Jared's final chilling words echoing in her mind. The trap was laid, now all that remained was to spring it at exactly the right moment. She'd feigned acceptance of meeting him alone, using every last acting skill to hide the terror constantly threatening to consume her. Jared had grinned wolfishly, immediately sensing her growing weakness under his constant pressure campaigns. Soon, he promised, "You'll forget all about resisting me. We belong together, Sarah, whether you see that yet or not." At the appointed hour, Sarah sent the pre-written decoy text, hinting she was ready to reconcile, if only he'd listen without anger first. Jared fell for the bait immediately, enthused GPS directions arriving within seconds, as expected. Now his car idled somewhere close by, her phone recorder prepped to capture his inevitable uncontrolled outburst as planned. Deep down, Sarah knew confronting Jared directly was a gamble with her life on the line. But it had come to this, living constantly under siege or taking her chances with a decisive end, whatever the cost. She'd survived thus far through blind luck and support alone. This endgame required active courage. Few could claim facing down a merciless stalker so deep in madness. Footsteps approached as expected, echoing eerily off crumbling concrete. Sarah edged along the wall, finding her hiding place behind a support beam. She slowed her rapid breathing with calming mantras, adrenaline sharpening her senses. This would be over soon, one way or another. Jared's shape materialized out of the darkness, wary confusion twisting his brow. "Sarah, are you in here, baby? I came just like you asked." His footsteps drew nearer, zeroing in on her location, unawares as Sarah forced herself to remain stone still. "I knew you'd come around eventually," Jared murmured, almost to himself. "No one understands us the way we understand each other." He rounded the column, freezing at the sight of Sarah glaring back defiantly. For a beat, they simply stared. Predator facing prey turned hunter at long last. Then Jared's face rippled into a mask of such demonic rage, Sarah almost faltered, her last resolve wavering under its savage intensity. "You tricked me," he growled, low and lethal as an oncoming landslide. Sarah held up her phone with a shaking hand, thumb hovering over the stop button. "It ends tonight, Jared," she answered, voice stronger than she felt. "Your threats and stalking are over. Confess to me clearly on video what you've done, and I'll let the authorities handle you from there." A humorless chuckle escaped him as Jared slowly advanced, causing Sarah to retreat step by step. "Do you really think after all this time, I'd just roll over and make it that easy? You're smarter than that, baby. Now, put the phone down before someone gets hurt." His threat shattered the last of Sarah's illusions, replacing fear with cold wrath. This monster would never stop coming. The only safety lay in eliminating the threat once and for all, by any means necessary. "No, you've had enough chances, Jared," she spat. "It's over now." Sarah lunged sideways just as he sprang, darting around a pillar. They twisted and struggled, her nails raking whatever skin she could find as Jared overpowered her through brute strength alone. Her phone skittered away, the ominous chuckle of her recorder capturing every grunt and snarl of the brutal fight for Sarah's life. Somehow, she wrenched free long enough to spot the glint of a discarded pipe, grabbing it up just as Jared's hands closed around her throat once more. With the last ounces of her strength, Sarah swung the pipe with a wordless battle cry. It connected with a sickening crunch, Jared's grip going lax as he crumpled to the floor. She collapsed, gasping, barely able to confirm his prone form sprawled unmoving. Only then did the magnitude of what she'd done begin to sink in through the adrenaline fog. Sarah crawled weakly to her phone, ending the damning recording with a bloody thumbprint. Her hands fumbled through blurred vision to call 911 on autopilot. "Please, help. I think I killed him. Jared, he was stalking me, tried to." "Oh, God, hurry." Dizzy and nauseous, Sarah slumped against the scuffed wall, watching Jared's chest for any signs of life through tears. It was over. For better or worse, his shadow would haunt her no more. She'd reclaimed her freedom by any means necessary, as the final cost demanded. I never believed in the magic of dating sites until I met Marta. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, the kind where you're content to just exist, and I was idly swiping through profiles, not expecting much. That's when her profile popped up. Marta, 29, with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. Her bio was a mix of witty and sincere, and I found myself hitting the likes button without a second thought. To my surprise, we matched, and soon we were lost in conversation. Marta was everything I could have hoped for. Charming, intelligent, and with a warmth that felt genuine. We shared interests in old movies, indie music, and a love for Italian cuisine. Our chats would stretch for hours, and I found myself eagerly waiting for her messages. As days turned into weeks, our connection deepened. We met in person, and she was even more captivating. Her laughter was infectious, and her stories, filled with adventures and dreams, left me in awe. I remember walking her home after our third date, the city lights casting a soft glow around us, thinking, this is it. She's the one. Marta had this way of making me feel seen, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. She would often say, "You understand me like no one else does," and I believed her. I found myself opening up about my past, my hopes, and even my fears. It was a connection I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. One evening, as we sat in a cozy corner of our favorite cafe, Marta leaned in close and whispered, "I've never felt this way before. You make me so happy." Her eyes sparkled with sincerity, and in that moment, I knew I was falling for her. Hard. As weeks turned into months, the idea of spending my life with Marta didn't just feel right. It felt inevitable. I started to imagine proposing to her, picturing her face lighting up as I'd get down on one knee. The thought of a future together filled me with a sense of completeness I hadn't known I was missing. But as perfect as everything seemed, I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It was like a whisper, subtle yet persistent, hinting that not everything was as it appeared. Little did I know, this was just the calm before the storm. The more I got to know Marta, the more I felt like I was peeling back layers of an intricate mystery. It started with small inconsistencies, little things that didn't quite add up. She would tell me stories about her past, but the details would change slightly each time. I brushed these off as misremembered facts. After all, who doesn't embellish their past a little? But then, the discrepancies grew. She mentioned a child, a little boy named Liam from a previous relationship. I was surprised. She'd never mentioned him before. When I asked why, she brushed it off, saying it was a painful topic tied to a custody battle with her ex. I sympathized, offering support, but something in her eyes flickered, a shadow of something I couldn't quite place. As weeks passed, I began to see a different side of Marta. The charming, carefree woman I'd fallen for was increasingly possessive and manipulative. She'd get upset if I spent time with friends or if I didn't reply to her messages immediately. "I just want us to be together, all the time," she'd say, her voice laced with a desperation that made me uneasy. I started to dig deeper into her past, driven by a mix of concern and curiosity. The more I uncovered, the more the image of the perfect woman I'd fallen for crumbled. Friends she'd mentioned didn't seem to exist. Stories about her past achievements and experiences unraveled into a web of lies. I felt like I was living in a twisted reality where nothing I knew about her was true. The turning point came one evening at her apartment. We were looking through old photos, and I stumbled upon a picture of her with a man and a child, a family portrait. When I asked about it, her demeanor changed instantly. She snatched the photo away, her eyes darkening. "You shouldn't have seen that," she hissed, her voice barely recognizable. That night, I lay awake, piecing together the puzzle of Marta's life. The charming facade, the lies, the possessiveness. It all pointed to something deeply unsettling. I realized I was in a relationship with a stranger who was becoming increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. As dawn broke, I knew what I had to do, but I was unprepared for the depth of Marta's deception and the lengths she would go to keep me in her life. I was about to enter a nightmare that would test the very limits of my sanity. The decision to end things with Marta was one of the hardest I've ever made. I thought it would be the end of the nightmare, but it was just the beginning. The day after I told her it was over, the stalking began. It started with constant messages and calls. When I blocked her number, she found other ways to reach me. Emails, social media, messages through friends. Then she started appearing everywhere. I'd see her outside my office, lingering near my car, or sitting in a cafe across from my apartment. Each sighting sent chills down my spine. Her presence was like a dark cloud, looming over my every move. One night, I came home to find her sitting on my doorstep. Her eyes were wild, her hair disheveled. "We're meant to be together," she insisted, her voice trembling. "You can't just throw away what we have." I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. It was as if she was living in a different reality. The encounters grew more frequent and more disturbing. She would leave notes on my car, send me photos of places I'd been that day. And once, I even found her inside my apartment. The police became a regular part of my life, but they could only do so much. "Get a restraining order," they advised. But even that seemed like a flimsy shield against her obsession. The climax came on a cold, rainy night. I was alone at home when I heard a knock at the door. It was Marta, but she was different this time. Her usual desperation was replaced by a calm, eerie resolve. She held a knife in her hand, its blade glinting in the dim porch light. "You don't get to leave me," she said, her voice eerily calm. "If I can't have you, no one can." What followed was a blur of terror and survival. I managed to lock myself in the bathroom, calling the police as I heard her trying to break down the door. The minutes until the police arrived were the longest of my life, filled with the sound of her manic screams and the thud of the knife against the door. When the police finally arrived, they found her sitting on the floor, sobbing, the knife lying beside her. As they took her away, her eyes met mine, filled with a mix of rage and sorrow. It was the last time I saw her. That night, I survived, but something inside me was irreparably broken. The woman I had once loved had become my worst nightmare, and the scars she left were not just physical but deep in my psyche. The days following Marta's arrest were a haze. I moved through them like a ghost, haunted by the memories of what had transpired. The apartment where we had shared so many moments felt like a prison, each room echoing with the remnants of a love that had turned into terror. I struggled to reconcile the Marta I had known with the one who had stood in my doorway, knife in hand. The woman I had planned to propose to had become a stranger, her actions driven by a madness I couldn't comprehend. The police said I was lucky to be alive, but survival felt like a heavy burden. Sleep was elusive, chased away by nightmares that replayed the night of the attack over and over. I would wake up in a cold sweat, her screams still ringing in my ears. Friends and family tried to offer comfort, but their words felt hollow. How could they understand the depth of fear and betrayal I felt? In the weeks that followed, I sought therapy, trying to piece together my shattered psyche. The therapist listened as I recounted the story, from the blissful beginnings to the harrowing end. "You were caught in a web of manipulation," she said. "It's not your fault." But guilt gnawed at me. Had I ignored the red flags? Had my desire for love blinded me to the truth? As I worked through the trauma, I began to see how Marta's need for control and adoration had twisted our relationship. She had craved praise and attention, manipulating reality to fit her narrative. I had been a character in her story, one she refused to let go even as the plot spiraled out of control. The road to recovery was long and arduous. I learned to trust again, but more importantly, I learned to trust my instincts. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always be a part of me, a reminder of the dangers of ignoring the warning signs. Now, as I sit here, reflecting on that chapter of my life, I feel a sense of relief. Relief that it's over, that I survived. But there's also a lingering sadness for the Marta I thought I knew, for the love that could have been but was lost in the shadows of her madness. I've moved on, but the experience has left an indelible mark on me. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are not under our beds or in the dark alleys. Sometimes they are the ones we invite into our hearts, not knowing their true nature until it's too late.